Thank you for inviting me here today. Is Islam a religion of peace? It's kind of like asking, is a rainbow yellow? Parts of it are, but the rainbow itself isn't. Islam covers a series of, a kind of spectrum of beliefs, from a la carte Muslims who will drink alcohol, who won't wear veils but still consider themselves to be culturally Muslim, through traditional Sunnis and Shias who just live their normal lives like people do of various religions, through persecuted Ahmadis, through the more mystical Sufis, through Islamists who impose Sharia by force on people who don't want it imposed on them, through to global terrorists who will happily carve your head off because of their beliefs. Now, all of this is Islam. Collectively, all of this is Islam. And collectively, it is not a religion of peace. It is at best a religion of contradictions. For many faithful Muslims, it is a source of comfort through submission, and for many dissidents, it is a source of oppression and violence. And also, in its most significant manifestation, asking whether Islam is a religion of peace is not like asking whether Quakers or any particular religion is a religion of peace. It's not even like asking whether Christianity today is a religion of peace. It's because Islam, while Islam certainly includes religious elements, and the core of its source of claims of power is from theology, it's actually less of a religion and more of a combination of integrated religious and political and judicial ideology and system of governance. And you can't disentangle, I'm sure you will agree with me on this, you can't disentangle the religious and political and judicial elements of Islam and say that one of these is Islam. It's the combination of all of those that constitutes Islam. And because of that, Islam cannot be peaceful. Because as a system of social governance, it has to be able to use violence in order to protect Islamic values. Just as secular liberal democracy has to use violence in order to protect secular liberal democratic values. That's the nature of social governance. So the difference between Islam and secular liberal democracy is not whether they're violent or not, it's not whether they're peaceful or not, it's the values that they're underpinning and the methods that they're using and the extent to which they use violence to protect those values. And I'm going to argue that Islam disproportionately uses violence, that it's more violent, and indeed that it requires more violence to protect it, to protect its values, than does secular liberal democracy. And that's because the laws and values of secular liberal democracy have evolved over the centuries. They've evolved to reflect gradually more nuanced views about human rights, about equality before the law, about freedom from discrimination, about freedom of conscience, religion and belief. Whereas the values and the Sharia law of Islam is shackled to texts that were written hundreds of years ago, centuries ago, up to 13 centuries ago. It's shackled to those texts, and it has to make whatever changes it is envisaging to be consistent with those texts and reflect the values of a considerably more violent era. Also, followers of Islam, unlike followers of secular democracy, have to believe that their ideology, their system of governance, is based on a book that was dictated by the creator of the universe, and therefore it cannot be wrong. Whereas I, as a modern secular democrat, am happy to say about any of my ideological beliefs that I might be mistaken, that if you show me evidence that I'm mistaken, I'll change my mind. I won't retreat into theological claims that force me to justify retaining the ethics of a more violent and barbaric era. And when I say a more barbaric era, I'm not restricting that to Muslims. I'm saying people generally were more barbaric in times past. And at this stage, well, I was going to make the obvious point. I think everybody has said it, so but I think it's important to stress it as well. That I'm talking about Islam as an ideology. I'm not talking about individual Muslims. Individual Muslims are, by and large, as ethical as anybody else on the planet. They have compassion, empathy, cooperation, reciprocity, fairness, justice, love. They have all the values, the ethical values that human beings share by virtue of our humanity. But their empathy and their compassion and their cooperation and their reciprocity and their fairness and their justice and their loving are corrupted by the demands and requirements of the ideology of Islam. And that's most evident in a particular verse from the Quran. You were talking about using the text itself. Quran verse 24:2, which it's about punishing adulterers. It says, "Strike the adulteress and the adulterer 100 times. Do not let compassion for them keep you from carrying out God's law, if you believe in God on the last day, and ensure that a group of believers witnesses the punishment. Do not let compassion for them keep you from carrying out God's law." Now, why do you think that they might have needed to add in that verse to the Quran? I suggest that it's because there were Muslims whose humanity and whose compassion were telling them, no, I shouldn't do this because it's wrong. And in order to get them to override their natural compassion, there was a verse added in saying, don't let your compassion stop you. Do it anyway. And that's a very powerful way of overriding people's compassion if you tell them that the creator of the universe is telling them that this is right. The Quran, look, like any religious text, the Quran is a very complex set of values that was written at different times. Parts of it written when Muhammad and his followers were being persecuted in Mecca. Parts of it written when Muhammad and his followers were running the show in Medina. And not surprisingly, you get different sets of values coming out of those two different sets of circumstances. But the Quran promotes many very good things morally. Don't lie, be good to your parents, be good to the poor, set slaves free, don't oppress people, don't have compulsion in religion. These are obviously very good things. But in the same book, you also have that men can beat their wives in certain circumstances. You have verses about cutting off the hands of thieves, of killing disbelievers, of fighting non-Muslims until they're in a state of subjection. Now, inevitably, when these issues arise, you'll get arguments about, well, these verses mean different things. It was the context at this time, or you have to read it in the original Arabic. You have any number of different arguments that suggest that these words don't mean what they actually say. But the difficulty with that is twofold. One is that by noticing that there are verses that you have to make those excuses for before you can justify them, irrespective of how you justify them, just by making that distinction, you're noticing that you're applying your own morality to the book. You're not getting your morality from the book, because if you were, you just automatically accept all of them on an equal basis. And the second difficulty is that Islam has no central theological authority, which means that ISIS or Al-Qaeda are as entitled to claim that their interpretation is the genuine word of Allah as you are to claim that they're mistaken. And they are as entitled to say that you're the ones that are theologically mistaken as you are to say about them. And the reality of history, the reality when you have these books that give these contradictory signals that can be interpreted by people on the basis of thinking that it's the creator of the universe telling them to do things. The reality is that Islam has consistently led to violence. From the massacre of the Jews in Medina, which was mentioned earlier on, after the Battle of the Trench, which was under Muhammad. This isn't even people misinterpreting him afterwards. This is when he was in charge. Through centuries of atrocities against Hindus in India, through to today when Islamic states will persecute people for saying or doing or believing the wrong thing, where currently there's a Christian mother in Pakistan facing execution by hanging for a blasphemy charge that arose from some domestic disagreement. And two politicians who spoke out in her favour were murdered. The governor of Punjab, who was a Muslim, and the minority minister, who was a Christian. The governor of Punjab murdered by his own bodyguard. So this is what happens when you mix unchanging and unchangeable, or certainly very difficult to change ideologies because they're based on these books that are supposedly written by the creator of the universe, and that have these verses that clearly inspire violence. So if you ask me, are Muslims peaceful people, I'll say yes, of course they are. They're as peaceful as anybody else. If you ask me, is Islam a religion of peace? I'll say no, it is not. It's not a religion of peace. It's not even a religion. It is an integrated ideology that combines religion, politics, judicial elements, and social governance. And it's an ideology imposed by force and unable to adjust to the evolving human rights standards that the Western world has gradually adjusted to. Not perfectly, but certainly a lot more than basing our ethics on books written hundreds of years ago, and indeed thousands of years ago. So if you believe that freedom of conscience and freedom of religion and equality before the law and freedom from discrimination are more peaceful in principle than hanging blasphemers or flogging adulterers or cutting the hands off thieves, I ask you to oppose the motion. Thank you very much. When I used to campaign against terrorism in Northern Ireland, there was a phrase that we used to use about people on both sides of the equation when the atrocities that they committed were pointed out to them, and that phrase was whataboutery. And what it essentially means is instead of addressing what their side have done, they try to change the topic onto what other people have done. I didn't come here to argue that the West is perfect. And in terms of the human rights abuses of the West that were raised by Joe and others, I was over in Geneva a couple of weeks ago campaigning and briefing the UN Human Rights Committee about the abuses of human rights in Ireland, the issues that you were raising and others. So if you ask me to come here and debate that, I'll happily debate it. But if you ask me to come here and debate whether Islam is a religion of peace, I expect that to be what I'm discussing. The second speaker, look, I understand you're a good person. I really genuinely do, and I don't mean to pick on you, but it's just you happen to say it. This is one of the things that religion can do, and that faith, and it's not just, I mean, it's when you say about capitalism, I agree with you about capitalism. I think the problem isn't religion, the problem is faith and dogma, which can be applied to secular things like unregulated capitalism or communism or anything like that. If you approach any ideology with faith as opposed to proportionate beliefs based on evidence and questioning, then you're going to run into problems. But one of the things that I find, I mean, the phrase "get over 9/11 already," you know, that somebody who I know is a good person would use a phrase like that. I mean, it just shows how these things can it's like I was talking about earlier on about the desensitisation, can corrupt our normal empathy and compassion and sensitivity and cause us to say things that I'm sure we don't really believe. Is that it? Okay. Okay, thank you very much.